Well, the Virtue of Prudence book I got going on because there was a very simple problem. I mean, first of all, there were four cardinal virtues in antiquity, and they were prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. Three of those virtues still remain as virtues, although perhaps courage and temperance aren't so important to people anymore, but they remain. But prudence seemed to decline as the centuries went on. So my question was fairly simple. What happened to this virtue? I mean, and the crown of the cardinal virtues was prudence, according to ancient ethical theory, and yet it ends up being, if it's a virtue at all, and I think by the time we get to Kant, it's pretty much dead as a virtue, it's a pretty minor one. It's certainly not the major virtue that it was in antiquity. So that question alone seems to me to be interesting. So a good chunk of the book is devoted to looking at, sort of what happened to the virtue of prudence over the centuries and through various thinkers. And I look at Kant and Hobbes and Adam Smith and Aquinas, a bit of Cicero and so forth, to try to give some account of what happened to that virtue. The virtue itself, of course, prudence, in English just doesn't carry any of the connotations it would have in antiquity. So it's probably better to talk about practical wisdom, which is really what the term meant, phronesis in the Greek, and even prudentia in Latin was pretty much talking about practical wisdom. It's hard to say the word prudence and have that connotation associated with it at all today in English, but practical wisdom is the key. And I was interested in the role of intelligence and the role of, if you will, reason, although again I have to be careful of that term, in ethical conduct and in people's lives. That was my main thing, so I try to develop that a bit as well in the book. I'll be overly simplistic, but I think as we move away from an agent-centered sort of ethics to either an impersonalist ethic or an agent-neutral kind of ethic, the virtue of prudence becomes much less important, because in an agent-centered ethic, I need to think about what I'm going to do with myself. In an impersonalist or agent-neutral kind of system, may not even need to think at all. All I need to do is understand what my duties are and follow them. And so to me, as for whatever reason, I mean, you could give various theories about this, as we moved away from that sort of agent-centered approach, which I associate with ancient philosophy or antiquity, the virtue of prudence, the importance of your own practical wisdom seems to diminish, and we get formulas, duties, sort of impersonal accounts of what we should do, agent-neutral accounts, and so forth. There are a couple other dimensions to this. How prudence became equivalent with sort of narrow self-interest is also a part of this historical story as well. And there I would put the burden on Hobbes, mainly the one who made the most of prudence in this light, and then taken over later by Kant. Interestingly, Adam Smith makes a valiant effort to try to resurrect the virtue of prudence a bit in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. I don't know how successful he is. He does make it a virtue, but he also says it's the least shining of the virtues. He giving benevolence a much higher place in the pantheon of virtues than prudence. Yeah, I think that we are reading people that pay attention to it. Philippa Foot might be one. I just finished a book by Julia Annis on virtues and intelligence that I think is trying to resurrect that. I know there are others as well. So yes, I think the virtue of prudence, as it was understood in antiquity and practical wisdom, really has a bit of a chance to come back in ethical theory. Well, the third book, The Norms of Liberty, of course, I co-wrote with my friend and colleague Douglas Rasmussen, and trying to connect it up with some of the other things that I've said. One of the things that we were concerned about was sort of this might be putting it too strongly, but the kind of amoralist or anti-moralist attitude among classical liberals, about the foundations of liberalism. The defensives have always been in terms of its consequences or its benefits or its sort of negative notion of we just don't know what the good is for people, so we should keep them free because nobody's... And we wanted to explore the sort of the moral foundations and thought that there was a kind of crisis about what the moral foundations might be for liberalism, and we wanted to explore that. That at the same time that, we recognize liberalism is not a philosophy of life, but a social political philosophy. So we wanted to sort of work with that in the book Norms of Liberty and discover what the roots and rudiments of classical liberalism and liberty really were when it came to ethics. I mean, we tried to make a distinction between types of norms, saying that some norms are really norms for setting up the game, if you will, and other norms are norms for playing the game. So we call the former meta-norms, and these are norms that society should or should be established in society so that people can pursue the norms that govern what makes living a life well or what makes living a life ethically. And, there are analogies you can draw here between, let's say, a game which has rules but isn't being played yet. Those would be like the meta-norms. And then the players can either play well or badly within those rules, and those would be sort of standard normative criteria. And what we want to say is liberalism is a political philosophy that's concerned with the former, that is the meta-norms, setting the rules of the game, not making people moral, not trying to make them moral, and there are reasons that we wouldn't want to do that, but making it possible for moral action to exist. And part of our critique of other political theories is their attempt to sort of meld the moral and the political, even though people recognize that distinction. When you look at their theories, they meld the two together quite often. There are two ways to answer that question. One is to suggest that the central principle of the meta-norms is to protect the possibility of self-directedness. That is, for you to act on your own initiative, because whatever thing is going to qualify as moral action has to be done by your self-direction. Otherwise, it's not a moral action for you. It might fit according to some rule, but would not be a moral action. So that's the main meta-norm. The specific ways in which that would work itself out in society, we're not real sure that's the job of philosophers to sort of do in detail. I mean, we can examine and criticize and talk about things, but there may be, let's say a legal history, a common law history, which deals with certain kinds of problems about how people would relate to each other, how they would set up a system of property rights and so forth, that we should be paying attention to because they've either had the benefit of lasting a long time or working out well in the past and so forth. And that might not be the philosopher's job to sort of a priori sit in the armchair and start saying, well, you need this meta-norm, you need that meta-norm. So the key one for us is, let's just call it the meta-norm of liberty, and then we might cash that out further in various ways with protecting property rights and so forth. I don't want to give the impression that the meta-norms themselves are outside of morality. That's not the case. You can't have a legal system, a political legal system that can't be justified in some sense. You need to have a justification, so there has to be some connection between the moral and the political. It's just that we distinguish between kinds of norms. Now, the meta-norms have the, let's say, the defense or the justification themselves of being necessary for moral conduct to occur because we live among others, and so we need some system. So we have to think about what that system should look like, and the should is normative here in light of what? Well, in light of what the ethical framework you're using is going to tell us is necessary for self-direction and, if you will, self-perfection. That's a very interesting question. I don't know. Let's say you buy our distinction between the two kinds of norms and meta-norms and regular norms. Does it require, let's say, the Aristotelian classical ethical framework that Doug and I give it in order to make that case? I don't know that I want to go that far, yes. What I will say that I'm pretty confident about is that it is comfortable and works quite well with that framework. And that, just to refer to another book Doug and I did, Liberty and Nature, that was the point of that book, was to say, look, you can be an Aristotelian in ethics and you can still be a classical liberal. Even though the two historically have not gone together very well, we wanted to argue in that book that they can go together. And I think what we're working on now is, again, trying to show that these are quite compatible frameworks for each other, even though that hasn't been the historical way liberalism has been defended. Well, I think probably Aristotle's the one who I have sort of adopted as my philosophic base, if you will, and I think of issues in much of the way I think an Aristotelian would think of issues. I would describe myself as a kind of Aristotelian. I think that's pretty much what I am. If you look, though, at my published work, there isn't all that much about Aristotle. It's more about other people. So that's a kind of base from which I work, and then I examine other thinkers in light of that to see how they compare, what the differences are, what I might gain from them, what I might not gain from them, and so forth. So that's the Spinoza issue. I mean, here's a guy who really looks in many respects anti-Aristotelian, and so I wanted to explore him partly for that reason. And I suspect that in the end, I think if Aristotle's wrong, then Spinoza's the guy we turn to, that sort of thing. I mean, that's how I would do it, or vice versa, I suppose. You could work it that way. And that's sort of the basic two for me. I've had a strong interest in Plato for a long time. I have a very different reading of Plato than most people. I think Plato is more of a raiser of issues than he is a purveyor of doctrine. And I read Plato that way. It might be totally wrong, might not be historically accurate, but I get a lot out of Plato when I look at him as that kind of philosopher, because most of the issues I'm concerned with I sort of find somewhere in Plato, and he raises them. So I would put him very high on my list. And in the last few years, I think I've spent some time in the 18th century looking at Shaftesbury and Mandeville and Adam Smith and so forth, and done a bit of writing on those people as well. Well, I mean, I pretty much liked the package. That is, naturalism and ethics, teleology, the role of reason in ethics, the realism in metaphysics. Most of the things, even if there's a problem with some specific thing, the kind of general categorization that Aristotle has, even the pluralism in substances, sort of the biological orientation of understanding of human nature and so forth, I pretty much am comfortable with all of it, at least in general terms, if not in specific terms. So that's why I think for me, it's fair to say I'm an Aristotelian.